Hey, Rebecca. I was doing a little bit of backstory research on you, and I see that you are a professor of law at the City University of New York. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, tell us a little bit about how you got into law and then how you progressed into being a professor of it.
Sure. So I was always going to be a research scientist. My plan was to be a biologist. And in fact, I majored in biology as an undergraduate. And then I went to graduate school where I was doing plant molecular genetic research. And intellectually, I loved it. But boy, I was not cut out to be a research scientist. I didn't have the meticulous nature that you need to make really careful experiments dealing with like 100 microliters of clear solution over an extended period of time. And I also realized that what interested me more were the social and political dimensions of science and scientific research. And also the LSAT was offered across the hall from my lab. So those factors all together had me taking the LSAT, and then when I did well on it, thinking about law school, and it's been a great fit for me.
I wanted to ask a little bit about being a researcher. Doesn't that kind of require a very introverted person who doesn't mind working in a cubicle?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time working at either in my office or a kitchen table or in a library. Most of my research is online these days rather than in dealing with actual physical books, and blessedly less and less microfiche as things are digitized. I guess if there's such a thing as an extroverted introvert, that's how I would describe myself. I love doing research. I spend hours upon hours diving down crazy rabbit holes. And I feel like that really adds texture to my legal analysis and my legal work because I can bring in so much history and so much of the social and political context in which decisions are made and laws are passed.
Right. I know you've written a book, and we're going to talk a lot about that. But getting back to the law for a second, what was your specialty during your years as a practicing attorney?
Environmental law is my specialty. It's been my specialty throughout my career. And so as a law professor, I not only teach environmental law, but I also work with community groups that are trying to figure out how to organize around questions that they need to address in terms of things that are being cited in their communities, or ways that facilities are being managed in their communities, or aspirations they have for green infrastructure and green, I can't think of what the word is, but like trees and plants and parks in their communities.
It appears to me, and I don't know much about anything, but it appears to me that environmental law is very political and will kind of swing one way or another depending on the political climate. Is that something you've had to deal with, and is that a natural part of law?
No, it's not a natural part of law. And yes, environmental law now is very political. But our environmental laws were adopted with broad bipartisan support. As recently as 2015, one of the laws that
Wow.
amended how toxic substances are handled, it's called the Toxic Substance Control Act, was amended unanimously in the Senate. Every single senator voted in favor of this law. So it's the hyperpartisanship we're seeing around environmental issues is really quite new.
So when this is happening now, does that make the law a little bit squishy and difficult to go through the court systems and for justice to be served?
It's really very problematic that we now have not only a judiciary, but advocates who are coming and not looking at questions in terms of what's the best answer, but in what's the answer that fits my political views. And I find that very disappointing because I personally think that the idea that people should be able to breathe air that isn't going to make them sick is not a partisan issue. I just can't believe that there are people who don't fundamentally agree with that, even if when it's presented in a context, they'll line up sort of against the idea that people should be able to breathe clean air or drink water that isn't contaminated.
What do you think the reason that anybody would be against that? What is the monetary or political momentum that drives that?
What we see is when you ask people those questions in the abstract, overwhelming majorities, regardless of political affiliation, believe that, yes, in fact, children should breathe clean air. And also will agree overwhelmingly. It was a survey done a couple of years ago, maybe 2020, 2022. I don't remember exactly when it was, about breathing clean air and whether people thought that even if it cost more money to produce products or businesses were less profitable, should people have the right to breathe clean air? And overwhelmingly, people said yes. But there are people who make a lot of money because they can externalize the costs of pollution onto us. Instead of handling them as a problem of their business, they can just release it into the air, release it into the water, and then it's our problem, those of us who want to breathe. And that is incredibly lucrative. And we have a system now where there are no limits on political spending. So we see, since the Citizens United decision was decided, the Supreme Court said that corporate speech is political speech, and so, and therefore protected by the First Amendment, and therefore there can't be limits on spending by actors who are very interested in the structure of the law, not because they're people, but because they are corporate entities that make a lot of money when laws do not require them to clean up their messes.
Are said political entities or corporate entities involved with thinking that perhaps, yeah, we're screwing up the earth, but you know what? It's not going to affect our generation, but we're going to make a lot of money in the immediate. Is that part of their thinking of allowing the world to just get sucked under by poisons and pollution?
I think for some people it is, but I also think that the people who benefit from the activities that generate pollution typically are not exposed to the burdens of that pollution, right? We have a very segregated society. We have a very segregated world. And when you can separate out the consequences from the benefits, it can be very difficult for people to understand what is happening. If you haven't lived in or been to a polluted, overburdened community, it's hard to imagine what that means and how bad it is and how dangerous it is and how people are getting sick. And, I think it was Upton Sinclair who said that it's really hard to get somebody to see a truth when their job depends on not seeing that truth. We got some of that going on too. I think that even people who are saying, well, it's not going to affect me now, if they have kids, or if they don't have kids, they have nieces and nephews. They care about the next generation, but maybe they only care about it through the lens of their own experience because they haven't seen what the consequences are. And people also have this belief that technology will save us somehow, that we'll invent some magic something that will solve the problem in the future.
When you're speaking about this topic, I'm automatically thinking about Erin Brockovich and Michael Moore's speaking about Flint, Michigan and the water situation there. Are those things that you've become involved with over the years?
I have not been directly involved with issues in Flint, but the water issue is like only the tip of the iceberg for the pollution issues in Flint. The air quality in Flint is far below what it should be, and what we see is Michigan officials steering yet more polluting infrastructure into that town and approving new facilities and expansions of facilities in that town while they're denying them in wealthier, whiter parts of the county or the state. So I've been studying this and I've been looking at it. I am not directly involved with any of the litigation or advocacy there, though I certainly know people who are.
So when you talk about various different things popping up in cities and so on, are you talking about like refineries or certain kinds of construction or manufacturing that would concentrate or focus pollution in a certain area?
Sometimes it's a refinery, sometimes it's a factory, sometimes it's a road. Where we build our roads through, especially highways, through Black communities and through poor communities, and they are incredibly polluting, especially when they're heavily used by trucks. And trucks can be incredibly polluting. Diesel fuel is really polluting. It doesn't have to be. There are plenty of technologies for much cleaner trucks and in fact for zero emission trucks. But the attempts to require use of those trucks have run into the sort of political roadblocks we were talking about of deep pocket funded opposition to laws that would ensure that people have clean air to breathe.
Did you ever get a chance to litigate against any of the major polluters or people who are destroying the earth?
I have not done a lot of litigation in my life. Because my function is really as a researcher, I have worked to help develop cases for people who then go into court and litigate. I don't really do that. I have a little bit at the beginning of my career, but mostly what I do is I gather information, I help create arguments, and of course I'm a law professor now, so I spend most of my time creating scholarly theories about how the law could be different and or how the way the law is now affects people's lives and welfare. That's, they're just sort of different aspects of the profession.
When you're doing your thing at the university, do you have a large group of students who are listening to you and learning from you?
Well, I have the great good fortune to teach at CUNY School of Law, which is a law school that is dedicated to law in the service of social needs. And we are a public interest law school. So everybody who goes there is looking to use their law degree to make things better for their community in some fashion. So yes, people are very interested in protecting the environment, among an array of
fighting the good fight.
It's you almost never find anybody who's actively opposed to protecting the environment. The devil's always in the details of what does that mean and how does it happen and who has to pay for it.
A lot of people get into professions thinking that they can really change the world and be able to improve things. And politicians come to mind, doctors come to mind, and attorneys come to mind. They get into it for all the right reasons, but then eventually or soon after, they get a little bit roadblocked and they have to start kowtowing to the people above them. Is that something that you see or have to fight against or help others with?
Well, the practice of law is very bifurcated. There are really large corporate law firms that are working to represent, to represent large corporations, global corporations in their interactions with each other or in their interactions with the government. That is incredibly lucrative work. The people who start right out of law school, before they've even found out if they've passed the bar, right? They make significantly more money than I do as a law professor. So the enticement of money is a real thing. And, that is what it is. If you want to work defending communities, if you want to work trying to make things better, you don't make anywhere near as much money. And that is something that everybody has to navigate for themselves as to what kind of a balance do they create. And then if you're in an institution of some kind, whether it's a law firm or an NGO, and you're a lawyer, you're rarely the one making the decisions about what issues to pursue and how to structure those arguments. I mean, eventually you might be part of those decisions, but certainly when you're starting out, you are much more told this is the line we're taking.
Yeah. In politics, for instance, if you want to be a congressperson or a senator, you have to toe the party line. I know that there's a bit of that in medicine, and I figured there was probably some of that in law as well.
Yeah, there certainly is.
What are a couple of issues right now that are really sticking in your craw that you would like to see solved or fixed or assisted?
I have such a long list. I would say renewable energy is, I think, one where we should all be agreeing because it is it is cheaper, it is safer, it is reliable, and it can be generated everywhere. And yet we see it has become hyper-partisan. And that frustrates me enormously because not only do we reduce carbon emissions when we switch away from fossil fuel to wind or solar or even hydro, but we also reduce the co-pollutants, the sulfur oxides, the nitrous oxides, the particulate matters that kill people, that make people sick, that keep kids out of school, that are unnecessary because we can produce energy without them.
If we take a look at electric vehicles, which are going through a bit of a renaissance right now, and people talk about that it's much cleaner, but then there are researchers probably like you who say, the carbon footprint to create electric vehicles is almost as bad as the petrol vehicles that are out there. What's your take on that?
Well, I have two takes. The first one is that even if the electricity that your vehicle is running is generated by coal-fired power plants, your carbon footprint is less if you're using an electric vehicle because the efficiency of those vehicles is so much more than an internal combustion engine. So they are a better choice even under the worst circumstances. And of course, circumstances can be way better than that, right? The energy that you're using to charge your car can be from renewable sources or from less polluting sources. The production of those vehicles is complicated. It's getting less complicated. The battery technology gets better every day, and it's relying less and less on critical minerals that are extracted under conditions that are ambiguous at best. But I guess my biggest frustration is we don't see people asking those questions about internal combustion engines. We only see them asking them about electric cars. And so the result is that what is now just gets accepted as the norm. But anything that's new, if it isn't perfect, it's sort of ripped to shreds. And nothing is perfect. It's only better.
Do you think that because we've been a petroleum-based society for so long that the lobby that's involved with pushing that is keeping electric and other forms of less polluting technologies from growing?
I mean, it's doing its best. It will lose that battle because it is just cheaper in the end to use renewable energies. It is cheaper in the short run in terms of the production and transmission, and it is cheaper in the long run in terms of the health impacts, the environmental impacts, and the cleanup that these polluting facilities necessitate. But it's incredibly lucrative. I mean, going all the way back to Standard Oil at the turn of the last century, right? What we've seen is that fossil fuel extraction is incredibly lucrative. The people who profit off of it then take that money and pour it into political influence that they use to create conditions that are welcoming to more fossil fuel infrastructure. It is our tax dollars that are building the fossil fuel infrastructure. You know, that said, I do want to go back to the point about electric cars, though, is one of the problems that we have in the United States is that in the 1930s to 1950s, we embraced this vision of society that was based on cars, individual cars. And so we don't have the public transit infrastructure that many, many other places in the world have. And that is, I think, a bigger problem even than which kind of car you are driving and where it gets its fuel from. And, you know, I live in New York City, and one of the reasons I live in New York City is we have an incredible mass transit system that can get you anywhere for $2.90. You know, anywhere in the city. And you don't have to drive. It's safer than being in a car. It's frequently faster than being in a car. And, you know, and it gives you a different sense of other people, of community, of the world than being isolated in your own little car. And one of the things that always interests me is people who say, I am stuck in traffic, as opposed to saying, I am traffic.
Right. Oh, interesting idea. Any of us who have traveled overseas or to places like New York City, and we think about, well, why don't we have high-speed rail? Why don't we have subways here? How far down the road do you think it is before the United States has stuff like that to be able to make us less dependent on petrol, gas,
well, that brings us back to the hyper-political environment that we're in, right? I mean, we could start that process tomorrow. We had, in fact, started that process a couple of years ago, and now we're moving away from it again. You know, I've given up trying to predict what's going to happen because I am always wrong. But
right.
It always interests me that people go and they travel and they say, oh, it's so great. You know, it was a walkable city, and I took the metro or I took the tube, and it was so convenient. And they come home and are like, yeah, and I'm getting in my car now. And they don't say, wait, we could have that.
Right.
We could have a system where you land at the airport, you get on the train, you take it to the town, and then you transfer to the trolley, and it's seamless, and it takes you to your corner. You know, you can do that in Switzerland, you can do that in Germany, you can do that in France. Like, we could do that. You can do that in China. We could do that too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would definitely look forward to a day when we could just hop on board something not unlike you have in New York. What part of New York are you
Queens.
in? Oh, okay. Now, you know, there is that fine print, though, in the New York contract that you're supposed to go down to Florida or out to California. Did you just cross that out?
Yeah, Florida's not really on my list right now.
Definitely.
Yeah. I also, you know, it's nice to go somewhere green for a little bit of time in the winter, but I like winter. I like the change in the seasons.
Yeah. We're going to move now to your book because this fascinates me. New York being one of my very favorite cities in the world. I've spent a lot of time there, as I mentioned. Tell us a little bit about the title of your book and then what it is that you specialize in the book.
And it flows from the conversation we were just having in many ways. The book is called Naming Gotham: The Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York Place Names. And what it is a really sort of place-based vision of history, using the names that we give to roads and bridges and civic infrastructure as a way into thinking about New York history, New York City history, United States history, and what that tells us. Like, when you look at these names, what does that tell us about who gets to name things, who gets to decide what counts as history, and how do all those pieces fit together, particularly in a really complicated place like New York? And I started with roads, which is why I was saying that it relates to our prior conversation.
You really need to know your way around. Are these things that you have experience or knowledge about, how they were named, how the Hudson was named, how Hell's Kitchen was named, those kinds of things?
Well, I focus more on the things that are named after people. So the Hudson, for people who don't know about New York City, the island of Manhattan, which is one of the boroughs of New York City, has the Hudson River on the west side and the East River on the east side. Now, I live in Queens, so the East River is to my west, which again is a moment of who gets to name things and whose experience defines our reality, right? Because the East River is to my west. But in Manhattan, it's to the east, and Manhattan is really the power center in New York City. The Hudson River was named after Henry Hudson, who was an explorer who was the first European to sail, as far as we know, to sail up the river.
So how does that get named then, even though that is the story of its naming? Who decided, let's name this that?
So, I'm actually not 100% sure for the Hudson River. The Dutch called it the North River, and they called the Hudson the North River, and the East River, they actually called that the East River. And Manhattan is a Lenape word. It's taken from a Lenape word that has a couple of meanings, or not. It goes back and forth. The island Manhattan means, but Manhattan was the name of the island itself and has stayed as the name of the island. So it was the British who named the river the Hudson River. And I don't actually, that's one of the things, the thing about cosplaying a historian rather than actually being one, because I'm a lawyer, is that I know what I know, and then on that, I don't know. So I don't know when that happened.
Well, at least you know what you don't know.
Sometimes I don't even think of it until someone asks me a question.
Wasn't New York primarily a Dutch enclave for a long time? The ones who kind of discovered New York, and was it called New Amsterdam at first, once upon a time?
It was a Dutch colony in the 1600s, and it was under the control of the Dutch West Indies Company. And so New York, the broader New York, was called New Netherlands, and the base in New York City, which was at the very tip of Manhattan, the southern tip of Manhattan, was called New Amsterdam. And there were a lot of British settlers who were going to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and then not liking the religious restrictions in the Massachusetts Bay colonies, sometimes because they were more free thinking and sometimes because they just wanted their own religious restrictions instead. So they were spreading out. That's how we got Rhode Island. And then British settlers and explorers started moving down into the Connecticut region. And the Dutch actually welcomed English settlers for a while because they would strategically allow English settlements outside of the Dutch settlements as a buffer with the indigenous peoples of the area. And the theory that that would be the first line of defense would be the English settlement. And then eventually when Stuyvesant was the governor, he was the last governor of New Netherlands, he started saying, wait a minute, first of all of these British people are coming in, and some of them are Quakers, and I don't like that. And they are not following the appropriate religious traditions, so I am going to stop allowing them to come in and restrict the ones who are here. And that sort of attracted the attention of an expansionist British monarch at the time who sent a fleet in and captured the town. And actually, the British settlers who were here were like a fifth column working against the Dutch colony.
Isn't it interesting, Rebecca, that just how much religion has gotten in the way of almost everything in this life, in this world? And, as far as settlements, as far as people trying to make cities happen and countries happen, it's always like these religious conflicts that make it very difficult for these places to exist
for
and
something
coexist.
That's supposed to be about love.
We're still
right?
seeing that. Right. It's all based in the same things. Like, you be good to me, I'll be good to you. It's like, we'll all get along. But really, it doesn't happen in
Yeah,
real
the
life,
spark of
does
the
it?
divine in every person means that we should be sort of accepting and respecting each other. And yet we're so busy drawing lines.
Right, right. What languages were being spoken before English really took over in the New York area?
Well, the Dutch were speaking Dutch, but the Sewanoi were speaking that. The Lenape were speaking an Algonquin sort of version of part of the Algonquin nation. So, in some places they're called the Delaware, some places they're called the Lenape. And they all had, various bands had various dialects. There's the Canarsie here as well. The Rockaways, lots of different groups that all had interchange. They could communicate with each other, but they had their own sort of regional dialect, I guess is what you would call it.
What made you decide to write a book about this background and history of New York and the naming conventions and stories along these lines?
Well, I did tell you I like research, but to be honest, I used to get stuck in traffic. Before I made that transition to IM traffic, my parents live in Pennsylvania, and they live in a place that you really can't get to on public transit, which drives me crazy. But I love them anyway. And so in going to see them, I had to drive to get there. And I used to drive on the Major Deegan Expressway, which is a road that runs through the south of the Bronx and connects to the George Washington Bridge. And it goes past Yankee Stadium. If you take that road, you are always sitting without moving. And if you're me and you're sitting without moving, you're also saying a lot of bad words. And I used to always say, I hate this Major Deegan. But no one knew who he was. And sort of, everyone knows who George Washington is, but no one had a clue who Major Deegan was, even though this very significant road that goes to the George Washington Bridge and past Yankee Stadium is named after him. And I used to sort of comment on that every single time. My family got a little sick of hearing that, so eventually they just said, well, why don't you find out who he was? So I did, and it turned out he was way less impressive than you'd think. And that sort of was interesting to me. I just assumed he was a war hero, that he was somebody who had died in battle leading troops or something. But no, he was a mid-level bureaucrat in a very corrupt administration in New York in the 1920s. And he was a major during World War I, but he was a major in the Army Corps of Engineers. Technically part of the American Expeditionary Force, but there was no expeditioning for him. He was here in New York throughout the war, designing fortifications and things like that, which is important work, but it doesn't usually get you a road.
How much research did you put into this before you actually put pen to paper? Like years?
I spent years research. Well, I didn't work on this project straight through because I do have this day job as a law professor, but it's my hobby.
It's this thing called life.
My hobby, and it's true to this day, my hobby is researching and like asking those questions. I went to a meeting on Sutphin Boulevard. And I was like, I wonder who Sutphin was. And I wound up doing a deep dive into this very interesting family where the person that the road is named after was Tammany Hall Politico. And Tammany Hall was the political machine that controlled New York for a good part of a century. Very corrupt. And he was for Tammany Hall, perhaps not that corrupt, but also was very corrupt. And his sons were sort of characters in their own right. And it was, did it matter to anybody but me? Not really, but super interesting. And now I think differently when I get off the subway at Sutphin Boulevard.
Right, right. Is New York the city for you, like the best of everything?
I love New York. New York has a lot of flaws, but I love being here. What I love the most about New York is that no matter who you are, no matter where you came from, no matter who you love, no matter what kind of food you want, no matter what kind of driving habits you have, like there's room for you here. People come to New York and they bring their food, they bring their language, they bring their culture, and there's room here for that. And we make this incredible city out of all of those experiences together.
More languages are spoken in Queens and or New York itself than anywhere else in the world.
Queens is the part of Queens that I live in, Western Queens, is linguistically the most diverse place on earth. And my kid, when they were a child, they used to call it not English. Walking down the street hearing not English. And we were always like, okay, let's guess what not English we're hearing. Like if I lived in Taiwan, so if it was Mandarin or Cantonese, I knew what it was and maybe could understand. But if it was Korean or Thai or Vietnamese or, I'm trying to think of so many, Khmer, Bangla, I don't know, wouldn't know a word of it. I mean, if it's Spanish, it's hard to be an American and it's hard to be a New Yorker without knowing some Spanish just through osmosis. And I did live in Texas and, it's hard. You pick up a little, but it's really fun to, yeah.
So you're a bit of a polyglot, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Oh, that's very cool. Tell me the demo that you're aiming for with your book. I would imagine that is people who have a similar background as you, people who like research and people who like history.
Well, I tried to write a book that is really gossipy and light. It's for people who are curious about the world. So, maybe somebody who's coming to New York who doesn't know anything about it, who wants to, like, an easy way into the history. Maybe a high school student who's taken the subway and they're looking at all the stops they're passing and wondering who they're named after. People who like history definitely really like this book. But my goal was to try to talk to people who wouldn't really be interested in a serious historical tome, but are interested in the world and want to know how we got to where we are. And let me just add one more thing, and that is that what I really hope is that people who read the book, not only will they learn a lot about New York, but wherever they are, whatever place they're in, they'll like sort of look up and say, oh, that's the so-and-so building. I wonder who that was. And then learn about where they live.
Right, so you're stimulating a lot of Google searches just with your book.
Yeah, they should probably be paying me.
Exactly. I agree. So once again, tell us the name of the book, and then I want to shift gears a little bit.
It's called Naming Gotham, The Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York Place Names.
The word Gotham itself, has it always referred to New York or just any major city?
So Gotham is actually an insult. It's an old English word that means goat herder. Oh God, what is that? I always blank on his name. The guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I just can't think of his name. For some reason, I always blank on his name. Anyway, I'll think of it. But he was sort of a very prominent New York writer, artist in the 1800s. And he was like a bit of a lad, and he saw himself as the intellectual elite. And he had this friends, this group of cronies who were very much men like him, who came from elite and Washington Irving. That's his name. And they created this magazine where they would write about New York, calling it Gotham, calling it goat herders. And it was a big insult to the people that they were sneering at, but it sort of stuck and it caught on as the name. And there's a town in England also called Gotham. And I got a couple of letters from people who live in that town when the book came out.
Oh, that's very cool. The only reference I can make to the word Gotham is Gotham City in the Batman series from the
Right, which is a thinly disguised New York City, right?
Right. So given the fact, Rebecca, that you're a researcher at heart, you just dig going deep like that, does that enter into your personal life as far as maybe what kind of choices food-wise that you might make on any given day?
Well, I am a vegetarian, and I have been for a very long time.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that's what my husband says too. He's not a vegetarian, but I just.
Yeah, but you're living in New York City. Oh my God!
But the vegetarian food in New York City is unbelievable, and there's an array of it in every culture.
Right.
I had both the fortune and the misfortune to marry somebody who was a really good cook. He actually worked for a little while as a sous chef at the Mesa Grill when Bobby Flay was still cooking there, a long time ago. And so I did very little cooking for a very long time in our marriage. He got ill and I had to take over the cooking, which was unfortunate for both of us in terms of the quality of the food. But I love to eat. I love good food. And one of the things that is so great about New York City is that not only is there great authentic cuisine from places around the world, but also there's this incredible fusion where you get the Colombian cook who's working in a fancy Chinese restaurant starts creating new kinds of dishes and he's working with, an Afghan sous chef. So they make this incredible fusion cuisine that is new and delicious and really fun.
When I was chefing in Los Angeles, some of the finest French cooks in LA are my Mexican team. They put together the most incredible cuisines coming from cultures other than their own. And you're right, it is that way all over the world now.
Yeah.
Okay, so what have you eaten today?
What have I eaten today? I made banana bread muffins yesterday, and I've probably had more of them today than I should have. But I haven't had a lot to eat because I'm on a deadline for another book project. So I've just been working. But I have been drinking a pretty good coffee and eating banana muffins.
Wow, so you put food on hold when you're busy? I
know,
get that.
it's hard to understand, but I work better when I'm a little hungry. It focuses my mind, and I can really write much more effectively that way.
How long have you been a vegetarian?
Since I was a kid. My parents are not.
And are you?
They thought it was very cute.
Okay.
They're like, oh, last week she's an astronaut, this week she's a vegetarian. But it just sort of stuck. And I mean, to be honest, because I like to travel, my life would be a lot easier if I weren't a vegetarian. But it's just not food to me at this point. I've just spent so many years being a vegetarian that I can't even imagine not. And I also, this is not why I became a vegetarian, but treating animals like widgets really bothers me. Factory farming is something that I find very disturbing. People raising animals for food, I don't do that, but that people have lived that way for millennia. I have no problem with that. But I find it really disturbing when we are treating living animals as though they were pieces of metal or something. And the abuses associated with that really disturb me.
I definitely get the whole ethical concern. I think that is probably the reason to be vegetarian for anybody who chooses to be that.
Also, the carbon footprint is...
Now, as far as as far as the type of cuisine, are you leaning towards perhaps Indian vegetarian foods or Southeast Asian or your own style of American style?
All of the above. So I lived in Taiwan, so I love Taiwanese food. And in Flushing, there's a very large Taiwanese community. So there are fantastic Taiwanese restaurants there. One just opened here in Astoria that I haven't been to yet, but I'm hoping to go to very soon. Love Indian food. But when I was in India, the thing that blew me away was the food was so delicious. Like every meal, no matter what it was, I was just like, this is just so delicious. The flavors, the freshness, it really took my breath away. The food here, I love it, but it doesn't have that sort of magical almost level of freshness.
Right. And you not really being a cook at heart, it's probably difficult for you to kind of replicate the flavors that you love so much.
It is. I try, but I don't succeed.
Is the school term over for you now? Are you entering into the whole summertime, let's have fun?
Well, summertime, let's do all the research.
Well, you get back into research, you're not going to go travel and sit on a beach somewhere.
No, if you're an academic, summer is when you get your really hardcore research done because you're not teaching and doing service and committee work. It's the time when you can really just go to archives and dig deep into things.
Not to rush it along, but what is your next book going to be?
Well, I'm finishing one right now with a colleague, and it's called Teaching Environmental Law, and it's a book that is intended for instructors at the undergraduate level and the graduate level who aren't lawyers, but are working in a sociology program or a geography program or a history program, and they're teaching a class on environmental law, and it's designed to help them structure the class so that it centers questions of justice and equity.
How important are social skills in the teaching environment?
Very. Teaching is like performing. It's, really have to be higher energy because people are busy. They have busy lives, especially when you're teaching adults like I am, because law students have already graduated college. The youngest ones are in their mid-20s and they range upwards to, there aren't very many who are my age, but there are some. And they're busy. And it's like they need they need you to grab their attention and to excite them with the material. And if you're talking about different kinds of deeds that you could use to file property, you have to make that interesting. And the way that you make that interesting is by digging into these historical facts that surround how we got the traditions that we have, how we got the patterns that we have, and what that means. Like, who was part of making them, who wasn't, who wins, who loses, and what it could look like if it were different as well.
Because now we all have such limited attention spans, and that people are always connected to that thing at the end of their arm, looking at the screens and so on, does that enter into the people that you're teaching who are a little bit older than the ones that maybe I'm referring to?
No, because we're decades into the always having that thing at the end of your arm. And it's really seductive. Like, I found when I go to conferences now, I don't bring my computer, even though I would like to take notes on it, because I start surfing. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. You're a professor. You've come here because this is what you care about. And instead of paying attention, you're surfing. So, like, how could I expect students to do otherwise? So I find I've stopped bringing my computer. I have a tablet that I take notes on by hand, and I try to get students off their devices. I don't forbid. Some professors forbid them in class. I think that's patronizing in a way that I don't want to be. But I try to engage them. I have a lot of visuals in my class, and I try to have an active conversation that will keep their attention.
Well, that's interesting that you're not collecting, because I've heard that there are some classrooms around the country that are collecting devices as the students step in.
I think that's happening at the high school level, but you can't tell adults that. Give me your phone. I mean, don't use your computer. Some professors do say no computers, but there are disability access issues with that you have to work around. And also, I just think people can be the judge of how they learn best and how they want to spend their time. If you're spending a lot of money.
I don't think anybody's going to say that they learn best with a device at the end of their arm, and that they would probably, speaking anonymously, maybe say, I can focus a lot better and learn a lot more without looking at my device.
Yeah, I think that's true. But people also like to take notes by typing. And, if they don't have their device, they can't do that.
Yeah. How has AI affected your current and perhaps your future world of research?
That is an excellent question. I am not a fan of AI. If they made AI that would do my laundry, I'd be all over it. But instead they're making...
That's coming.
Instead of liberating us from the chores that we don't want to do so that we can spend time thinking and being creative and analyzing, what we're seeing is AI, people saying AI can do that stuff for you, but that's what makes us human, and that's the part that we want to do. With my students, law schools for exam purposes have software that they require students to use that locks down their computer and basically turns it into a typewriter. And that's what the bar uses, and that's what most law schools use for exams. So we don't have that issue with exams, and I always require in-class exams, because I think that students learn better when they prepare for an in-class exam than if they think they're at home and they can just look it up as they go along. Yeah.
So, cheating is definitely an issue, and I could see why you'd want to have things going on in classroom.
My kid is a first-year college student, and for his English classes, they've been writing in class in blue books, their drafts of their essays. And I'm thinking, grading handwritten stuff is hard. I've been teaching long enough that I was grading handwritten exams in blue books, and grading typewritten stuff is a whole lot easier. But it's a big problem. I think it's more of a problem at the undergraduate level than it is at the law school level. And I don't know exactly how I'm going to be handling it for my seminar classes where students are writing papers. Mostly, I think we handle it because we're constantly talking about the ideas and the issues in class. So if they're using AI, they have to be using it as a supplementary thing, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do the work. Which is, of course, the point of the whole thing, right? Is to do the work and to think about it and to learn and get excited about.
In some ways, it's relatively easy to identify work that's been crafted by AI in the sense of maybe just punctuation. And because when you take a look at people's writing papers and things like that, you would see just so many misspelled words and no punctuation, and that's just the way it is. How much weight does something like that carry when you're doing the grading?
In law school, everything has to be perfect, because we're training people to submit things to courts. The citations have to be perfect, structure has to be perfect, the spelling has to be perfect. And we've seen, right, a number of lawyers get into very serious trouble because they relied on AI that made up citations for them. What we're trying to teach people is like due diligence is you never cite anything you haven't read. Like people cut corners, we try to convince them not to, but at a minimum, you have to at least verify that it's real and that the way somebody else has described it is accurate. Always trying to tell students, just because somebody else cited something doesn't mean they were right. You have to go look and make sure because they could be wrong. And there's plenty of wrong stuff that has become true because it's been repeated so far. I found that out with my book, actually. One of the people, a guy named Arthur Sheridan. Sheridan Boulevard is named after him. Not the General Sheridan from the Revolutionary War. Arthur Sheridan was another mid-level bureaucrat. There's a whole sort of slew of roads in New York that I call sort of bureaucrats with roads, that are people who, if, they were like perfectly fine, but if they hadn't been white guys and if they hadn't been friends with Robert Moses, there'd be nothing named after them. And Arthur Sheridan is right. One of them. But his self-description was that he had gotten 2 presidential commendations for his project designs, for he was an architect. And neither of the presidential libraries from the people who he had said had given him commendations had given him commendations. They might, as the Roosevelt Library said to me that, probably what happened was he was part of a project that got a commendation, and that's how it has morphed. But it is internet true. If you look him up, you will see that he received 2 presidential commendations in almost every mention of the guy. Even though, right, when I actually looked at it, because I wanted to see what was he commended for, what did it say? Nothing.
Wow. There's just so much BS going on when people do resumes and things like that, because you want to get attention, you want to get your foot in the door. Otherwise, you'll just go into the round file. So people have to try to get around that.
Yeah, and, I think AI is really, that's a place where it is really shaping things in a fashion that is troubling, because if you don't have exactly the right word or you have the wrong word, no human being is ever going to look at your stuff. And that is, I think, a real problem. And I don't know what the answer is to it.
I think that everybody is involved with it and it's moving along at such a rapid rate. Like, for instance, you take a look at the positive nature of what AI can do, perhaps scan x-rays 10,000 times faster than the human eye and get everything right. Whereas a doctor who has to do it will take him, months and months to do the same amount, and he'll get a lot wrong as far as what he sees. So I think AI definitely has its place. And, I just was curious about how it kind of worked with you.
Yeah, I don't really use it much. I know a lot of professors do. I think that the point of this is the thinking. If I were, what I might use it for, I haven't done this, but what I could see using it for is if I wanted to assess every case in New York that resolved indigenous land claims from the colonial period to now, I could see like doing a first scan with asking AI to do a first scan and to divide things up and to highlight cases where this was the main issue. That could be helpful. That could that could be a way to dramatically reduce research time to get you to the parts that you need to read and think about and analyze.
Who would have a vested interest outside of a researcher for that particular bit of information?
So there's a tribe in New York called the Manhassets that were deprived of their tribal status under state law and their property in an incredibly racist decision in 1918. And they have been trying for a century to get their tribal status restored. And so I've been doing some work analyzing the ways that the 1918 decision was wrong. And I think it was wrong. It was wrong on the law. It was wrong on the facts, and it was wrong as a matter of policy. And in doing that, I had a research assistant looking at cases for 150 years. And this could be a way to dramatically speed up that process, so that they could look at the most relevant cases. And then, from there, you probably find other things that AI doesn't recognize as relevant, but actually are. That's right, where the human intellect matters. I could, they're not in court, but this is something that is before the legislature, and the legislature has voted multiple times to restore the tribal status, and the governor has vetoed it multiple times. So trying to make an argument that is persuasive as to why this is an appropriate decision for New York to make is a place where you would see that kind of an analysis.
How binding are decisions? How far back can you go to try to overturn something, or is it a done deal once the decision is made?
So depends what you mean, right? This was a court made this decision in the early part of the 20th century, and it was binding on the people, and it had a devastating effect on them. But the legislature has said, right, this decision was erroneous. It said that this tribe no longer exists, and here they are in 2018 and 2019 and 2020. Right, these people are here, and they were also in the courtroom when the decision was made. The court basically said to a group of people who were there as a tribe, "You do not exist." So the legislature has the capacity to make law, and could make law. In our system, the legislature makes law. The executive administers the law, takes care that the law be faithfully executed, and the court interprets the law. The court erroneously, in my mind, interpreted the law of tribal recognition in this case. The legislature could say differently, right? The legislature could say, was it a legal error that we are going to fix with a new law that says, yes, we recognize this tribe. And they have done that, but the governor has vetoed it. And sort of that relationship between the governor and the legislature in terms of sort of creating law and administering law is a very complicated one, as we're seeing on the national scale right now, right?
I just wanted to ask a couple questions that I had in mind. Seeing as though you're a researcher and you're very, very is it a right brain person who is into research and facts and figures? What do you do for your creative side of your world?
That is something I struggle with. I really do, because I don't like not doing things well. And I am really not good at drawing, at painting, at crafting, or at cooking. And so I'm always looking for a way to sort of use that creativity. Now, one of the things I do is I collaborate with artists a lot. Now, I'm sort of the right brain part of those collaborations, but I at least get to be involved in a host of artistic projects, one of which is a series of environmental justice comics that I make with an artist named Charlie LaGreca. And those are all, by the way, anybody listening who wants to see them, they are all available for free download from my website, which is just my name, Rebecca Bratspies. And so there are 3 comic books that are, maybe graphic novels is a better word. They're, significant things. There are 2 shorter pamphlets that we made, one about the census, one about the Freedom of Information Act, and then there are a series of comic vignettes, not funny, but comic style vignettes, not like funny haha vignettes, that we've been making with the United Nations Environmental Program about environmental defenders around the world and the dangers that they face as they stand up for forests and rivers and sort of their. Well,
what's the origin of your last name?
Bratspies is a German name. A Bratspies is the bit that you put the meat on to roast it. Good name for vegetarian, right?
Oh, yum. You see, you're right there in the whole food world.
You didn't even ask me about Peter Cooper, who was the founder of Cooper Union, among other things, who invented Jell-O.
I must know this.
Fascinating story. So he was really one of those rags to riches story of the 18th century. Right, had 1 year of formal education, but was an inveterate tinkerer. He was always making stuff. I mean, among the things he made was the first prototype of a steam locomotive in the United States, and a musical cradle, among other things, and Jell-O. He invented Jell-O, and he then sold the patents to a cough drop manufacturer who added colored, sugared flavoring to it and made what we now know, and sold it under the name of Jell-O. That's how we got it. So next time you're sick...
And Jell-O is extracted from the hooves of cattle, right, or calves?
But it's not. Most of it is not anymore. Most gelatin now is not extracted from the hooves of cattle.
It's plant-based
now?
Is,
yeah, or it's lab created in a lab. The gelatin can be created in a lab. But Peter Cooper, among the various businesses that he he was a grocer, and then he had slaughterhouses, and hence the Jell-O at the time. And in fact, in early environmental case, he was ordered to move his slaughterhouses out of Manhattan because they were so polluting. And he wound up moving them to Queens, to the Newtown Creek area, which is also incredibly polluted, though he was not the only one polluting it. And when the city of Greater New York was created in 1898, it was Brooklyn and Queens voted to join Manhattan and create the city of Greater New York. The town that was formerly named Newtown was like, yeah, we're changing our name because we don't want to be associated with the pollution from the creek that was polluted in part by Peter Cooper, who otherwise was a really good guy. He's one of the heroes in my book.
So we have him to thank for all those aspic dishes in the 60s and 70s.
With marshmallow and banana in them. And
Do you remember those? Yeah. Oh, my God. So being a vegetarian, that means you're not really one who's going to eat honey or Jell-O and things that,
well, I'm not vegan.
Animals have been a part of.
Right.
Okay.
So there's a difference between a vegetarian and vegan. Vegetarians just don't eat we don't eat like the flesh of animals. But products like eggs.
Nothing with a face.
What I always say is nothing that could escape. And you got to stretch it a little bit with clams. They have a gastropod and they can't really escape, but they don't really have a face either. But
so you eat clams?
No,
I don't.
Saying. I don't eat clams, but.
Oh, you don't?
I'm saying they have a gastropod. In theory, they could move. Be very slow, be hard for them to escape. But
right.
But I'm not vegan.
I'm glad we clarified that. So, Rebecca, is it RebeccaBratspies.com where people would want to check you out, your book?
Yeah. So my website is just my name, RebeccaBratspies.com. You can find all kinds of information about naming Gotham there. You can find all of the comic books. As I said, they are all available for free download. If you want to use them for any educational or nonprofit use, you are free to do that. And then if you're interested in my scholarship, you can find the links to much of it there. It's also freely available on the web. Probably most listeners are not going to be what excites them, but check it out if you want to.
Hey, if we only knew what excited people, that we would do only that. So we might as well
people don't
put
know
it
what
out
excites
there.
them until they find out.
True. Very, very true. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rebecca, here on 50 Tastes of Grey. Really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Good. Thanks.
It was a great conversation.
Same here. Nice meeting you. Aloha.